He placed the commitment papers beside his glass of blood-red wine, smiling like a predator who had finally cornered his prey. My father believed he could lock me away and steal the $580 million empire I had built from nothing. He thought he held a loaded gun to my head, but he was wrong. That gun was empty. I was the one holding the detonator. Tonight, I did not come to surrender. I came to collect a debt. My name is Stephen Martinez, and from where I stood on the 58th floor of the Azure Chicago, looked less like a city and more like a circuit board dying in the cold. The glass walls of my office were thick enough to silence the howling wind, but they could not hide the violence of the snowstorm battering the skyline. Down there, amidst the gridlock and the slush, people were rushing home, fighting the elements for a scrap of warmth. Up here in the penthouse suite of the crown jewel of the Horizon Luxury Group, the air was filtered, scented, with white tea and cedar, and perfectly temperature-controlled at 72 degrees. I took a sip of whiskey, allowing the burn to settle in my chest. It was a 25-year-old single malt, costing more per bottle than my first car. I swirled the amber liquid, watching the city lights blur through the glass. This was what victory looked like. Or so the magazines told me. Forbes had recently estimated my personal net worth at $580 million. They called me a visionary, the prodigal son who had turned his back on old money to build a new empire of technology-driven affordable luxury. They wrote about the algorithm I developed to optimize room pricing, the seamless, automated check-in systems, and the minimalist aesthetic that defined the Horizon brand. They did not write about the nights I spent sleeping in a Honda Civic parked behind a 24-hour diner. They did not write about the hunger that felt like a physical weight in my gut, or the humiliation of begging for a loan from a bank manager who looked at my last name and sneered because my father had blacklisted me. I turned away from the window, catching my reflection in the dark glass. At 38 years old, I wore my success like a suit of armor. The bespoke tailoring concealed the scars, both literal and metaphorical. I had built this world to prove a point, to construct a fortress so high that the man who lived in Sterling Manor could never touch me again. Yet as I looked at the vast, empty expanse of my office, a familiar hollow ache settled between my ribs. The silence of the 58th floor was expensive, but it was still just silence. The heavy oak doors opened, breaking the spell. Sarah walked in her heels, clicking rhythmically against the marble floor. My wife, the only person in this world who knew Stephen Martinez before he was a brand. She was holding a tablet and a thick manila folder, her expression unreadable. Even after 15 years, she still had the power to stop my breath. She was wearing a cream-colored blouse and a pencil skirt, her hair pulled back in a severe bun that meant she had been in court all day. Sarah was not just the woman I loved. She was the sharpest corporate attorney in Chicago and the iron spine of our operation. "You are brooding," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet. It was not an accusation, just a statement of fact. She placed the tablet on the desk and walked over to me, sliding her arm through mine. She smelled of rain and vanilla. "I am thinking," I corrected, leaning into her touch. "There is a difference." "You are thinking about the past," she said softly. "I can see it on your shoulders. You carry it like a backpack full of bricks, Stephen." I sighed, looking back out at the storm. The Q4 projections are up 12%. We are opening the new location in Tokyo in 6 months. Everything is perfect. So why do I feel like I am waiting for the other shoe to drop? Sarah squeezed my arm. Because you are used to the floor falling out from under you, but it will not. We built this floor. It is solid concrete. She was right. She was always right. When Richard Sterling threw me out into the snow 15 years ago, stripped of my inheritance and my dignity, Sarah was the one who pulled me into her cramped dorm room. She fed me when I had no money. She believed in my crazy idea for a hotel chain when everyone else laughed. She was the architect of my survival. The peace of the moment was shattered by the vibration of my phone on the desk. It was a harsh, intrusive sound in the quiet room. I glanced at the screen. No caller ID. A cold prickle of intuition ran down my spine. Only a handful of people had this private number. I picked it up. "This is Martinez." "Mr. Martinez," a female voice said. It was crisp, professional, and utterly devoid of warmth. I recognized it immediately. It was Jillian, my father's personal executive assistant. She had been with him for 2 decades, a gatekeeper who had watched me beg for an audience with my own father and turned me away with a polite smile. "Jillian," I said, my voice dropping an octave, "to what do I owe the displeasure?" "Mr. Sterling requires your presence," she said, ignoring my tone. She did not say, "your father." It was always Mystery Sterling, as if he were a deity we both served. Tonight, 7 o'clock at the Manor, I felt a physical jolt like a missed step on a staircase. "I am busy, Jillian. I have a company to run. Unlike Richard, I actually work for a living." "It is regarding a sensitive family matter," she continued, robotic and rehearsed. "He insists it cannot wait. He said to tell you that it concerns the future of the Sterling legacy. He expects you for dinner." "Why, tell him to go to hell," I said, my grip tightening on the phone. "He also said," Jillian added, her voice dropping slightly, "that if you do not come, he will take steps to ensure your current business interests are complicated. He mentioned the zoning permits for your new construction in Miami. It would be a shame if the mayor decided to review them." The line went dead. I stood there, the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the dial tone. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, erratic rhythm that I hated. My hands, which had signed deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars without shaking, were trembling. It was a visceral Pavlovian response. Richard Sterling had spent the first 20 years of my life conditioning me to fear him. He controlled the air I breathed. He decided when I ate, what I wore, and who I was. Even now, with $580 million in the bank and an ocean of distance between us, his voice, even through a proxy, could reduce me to that scared boy standing in the foyer waiting for punishment. "Stephen," Sarah's voice was sharp. She was studying my face. "Who was it?" "Jillian," I said, placing the phone down carefully, as if it were a bomb. "He wants me at the Manor. Tonight. And he threatened the Miami project if I do not show up." I walked over to the bar and poured another drink, my movements jerky. "He is summoning me, Sarah, like a dog. He wants to play happy family. Probably wants to parade me in front of his new wife, and that useless son of hers, show them how generous he is by allowing the exile to return." "You are shaking," Sarah said. She did not move to hug me this time. She walked to the desk and picked up the manila folder she had brought in. "I am angry," I lied. "You are terrified," she countered. "You are reacting exactly how he wants you to react. He pushes a button and you jump." "I am not going," I said, slamming the glass down. "I am done with him." "You have to go," Sarah said calmly. I turned to her, incredulous. "Excuse me? You want me to go back to that house? After everything he did to us? He cut me off, Sarah. He tried to ruin my credit so I could not get a loan. He made us live on instant noodles for 3 years." "I know," Sarah said, her eyes flashing. "I was there, remember? I remember every single insult. I remember the way he looked at me like I was something he scraped off his shoe." She walked around the desk and tossed the folder down in front of me. It landed with a heavy thud. "That is why you are going. Not to surrender, but to see this." I looked at the folder. It was marked confidential in Sarah's handwriting. "What is this?" "I have been doing some digging," Sarah said, leaning her hip against the desk. "You know I have friends in forensic accounting. I asked them to take a look at Sterling Capital, just out of curiosity." I opened the folder. The first page was a summary of assets and liabilities. I scanned the numbers, my brow furrowing. "This cannot be right," I said. "Sterling Capital is a fortress. They have holdings in oil, real estate, pharmaceuticals." "Had," Sarah corrected. "Turn the page." I flipped through the documents. There were records of massive divestments, properties sold quietly below market value, loans taken out against assets that were already leveraged. It was a bleeding wound of finance. "He is hemorrhaging money," I whispered. "The Venezuelan real estate project?" "A total loss," Sarah said. $80 million gone overnight when the government seized the land. "And the tech startup he poured money into? Bankrupt last quarter." "But he is still spending like a king," I said, looking up at her. "The parties, the cars, the renovations on the manor. That is the best part," Sarah said, a dark smile playing on her lips. "Look at the creditor list on page 10. I turned to the page. My eyes widened. "Vanguard Holdings? Who are they?" "Shadow banking," Sarah explained. "High-risk, high-interest lenders who operate just outside the regulatory framework. You only go to them when the legitimate banks have cut you off. Richard borrowed $300 million from them 2 years ago to cover his losses and maintain appearances. It is a balloon loan, Stephen." I looked at the date on the contract. The maturity date. "It's 48 hours ago," Sarah finished. "He has defaulted. He is technically insolvent. He does not own the manor. He does not own the company. He is just squatting in a house of cards that is currently on fire." The trembling in my hands stopped. The rapid thumping of my heart slowed, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. The fear that had gripped me moments ago evaporated, replaced by something far more potent. Realization. Richard Sterling wasn't summoning me to assert dominance. He wasn't calling me there to belittle my success or to gloat. He was calling me because he was desperate. He was drowning, and he looked at his estranged son, the son he had discarded, and saw a life raft made of $580 million. "He thinks he is setting a trap," I said, my voice steady now. "He thinks he can bully me into bailing him out. Or maybe he has some scheme to force me to sign over assets." "He likely does," Sarah said. "He is a narcissist. He cannot conceive of a world where he is not in control. He thinks you are still the boy who is afraid of the dark." I closed the folder and ran my hand over the cover. The texture of the paper felt grounding. This wasn't just information, it was ammunition. It was a loaded weapon, and for the first time in my life, I was the one holding it. "He wants to talk about family business," I said, a humorless laugh escaping my throat. "Fine, I will go. I will sit at his table. I will drink his wine, and I will listen to whatever lies he has prepared." "Take the file," Sarah said. "Do not let him gaslight you. When he tries to make you feel small, look at those numbers. Remember that you are the CEO of Horizon Luxury Group, and he is a beggar in a bespoke suit." I looked at my wife. "You are not coming with me?" "No," Sarah shook her head. "This is between you and him. You need to face him alone, Stephen. You need to walk into that house and realize it does not have power over you anymore. But I will be on standby. I have the legal team prepped. If he tries anything legal, we will bury him in paperwork before he can blink." I nodded, feeling a surge of gratitude so strong it almost hurt. I walked over to the coat rack and grabbed my black wool overcoat. It was cashmere tailored in Italy, shielding me against the Chicago winter. But tonight, I needed more than just protection from the cold. I picked up the folder and tucked it securely into the inside pocket of my coat, right against my heart. "He thinks he is calling the shots," I said, turning to Sarah one last time. "He thinks I am coming to seek his approval." "Show him he is wrong," Sarah said, her eyes fierce. "Go get him." I walked to the elevator, the heavy doors sliding open with a soft chime. As I stepped inside and pressed the button for the garage, I checked my reflection in the polished steel doors. The fear was gone. In its place was the cold, hard resolve of a businessman who smells blood in the water. Richard Sterling had spent my entire childhood teaching me that the world was a cruel place where only the strong survived. He had taught me to be ruthless. He had taught me to exploit weakness. Tonight, I was going to show him just how well I had learned his lessons. The drive to Sterling Manor would take 45 minutes in this snow. That gave me exactly 3/4 of an hour to prepare my eulogy for the father I never had, and to sharpen the knife for the businessman I was about to destroy. I stepped out into the biting wind of the parking garage, the cold air filling my lungs. It was time to go home. The heavy iron gates of Sterling Manor had closed behind me, sealing me inside the estate that had haunted my nightmares for a decade and a half. As I stepped out of my car, the wind bit at my face, but the cold I felt radiating from the house was far more piercing. From the outside, the mansion looked exactly as I remembered it. It was a sprawling limestone monstrosity that screamed old money and power illuminated by floodlights that cut through the winter darkness. However, as I approached the massive oak front doors, the illusion began to fracture. I have spent the last 10 years inspecting luxury properties. My eyes are trained to spot the hairline crack in the marble, the slight discoloration in the velvet, the dust that gathers on the chandelier crystals. The maintenance of a property like this costs hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. As I reached for the brass knocker, I noticed the tarnishing around the edges. It had not been polished in weeks. The stone steps beneath my feet had not been salted properly, leaving dangerous patches of black ice. These were small details invisible to the untrained eye, but to me they were screaming. They whispered of a staff that had been cut back, of corners being cut, of a kingdom that was slowly running out of gold. The door swung open before I could knock. It was not the old butler Higgins who greeted me. Higgins had been a fixture of my childhood, a man who had once snuck me a sandwich when my father sent me to bed without dinner. Instead, a young man in an ill-fitting uniform stood there. He looked tired and underpaid. I stepped into the foyer. The heat hit me first, or rather the lack of it. The thermostat was set low, hovering around 60 degrees. It was a subtle economy, the kind a man makes when he is watching the utility bills, but does not want to admit it. Underneath the scent of expensive potpourri, there was something else. It was faint, barely perceptible, but unmistakable to someone who has renovated historic buildings. Dampness. Rot. The smell of a house that is slowly dying from the inside out. "They are waiting for you in the drawing room, sir," the young man said, taking my coat. He did not make eye contact. I adjusted my cuffs and walked toward the double doors on the left. My footsteps echoed too loudly on the checkered marble floor. I felt like an intruder in a museum that was closing down. Inside the drawing room, the tableau was set. A fire crackled in the hearth, but it was too small for the cavernous room, doing little to chase away the chill. Standing near the fireplace was Elena, my father's third wife. She was 32 years old, 6 years younger than I was. When Richard married her 5 years ago, she had been a vibrant, ambitious socialite. Now she looked brittle. Her blonde hair was perfectly coiffed, and her diamond earrings caught the firelight, but her eyes were darting around the room like a trapped animal. She held a glass of white wine, with a grip so tight her knuckles were white. Sitting on the leather sofa was Julian, my half-brother. At 25, he was the son Richard had actually wanted. He had been groomed to be the heir, given every advantage I had been denied. Yet as he looked up at me, I saw no triumph in his face. I saw exhaustion. He was slumped in his seat, swirling a tumbler of scotch. His shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. "Stephen," Elena said, her voice high and brittle. "We did not think you would come." "Elena," I nodded to her, keeping my distance. "Julian," Julian grunted, taking a heavy swallow of his drink. "Look who it is. the Hotel King of Chicago. Did you park your valet ticket yourself, or did you have your driver do it?" "I drove myself," I said calmly. "It is good to see you, Julian. You look relaxed." It was a lie. He looked like a man unraveling. He glared at me, sensing the sarcasm, but before he could retort, the heavy connecting doors to the library opened. Richard Sterling entered the room. The air in the room seemed to change instantly. It was a vacuum effect. He sucked the oxygen out of the space, just by existing. He walked with the same predatory grace I remembered, chest out, chin, raised a silver-haired lion, surveying his territory. He was smiling, but the smile did not reach his eyes. His eyes were cold, calculating chips of blue ice. "Stephen," he said, his voice a deep baritone that vibrated in my chest. "You are late." "The roads were bad," I said, not offering an apology. He stopped in front of me, looking me up and down. He was inspecting me, searching for the scared boy he had thrown out into the snow. He was looking for the slouch, the averted gaze, the trembling hands. I gave him none of it. I stood my ground, meeting his stare with a level gaze of my own. I saw a flicker of confusion in his eyes, quickly masked. "You have filled out," he said, dismissing my physical presence with a wave of his hand. "Though that suit, it is a bit loud, isn't it? A bit of new money." "It is Italian," I said, "and it fits." I ran my eyes over him in return. To anyone else, Richard looked impeccable, but I saw what he was trying to hide. The suit he was wearing was a charcoal pinstripe I recognized. He had worn it to the charity gala in 2020. The fabric at the elbows was developing a telltale shine. The watch on his wrist was his Patek Philippe, but he wasn't wearing the diamond cufflinks he usually favored for family dinners. He was recycling his wardrobe. "Shall we?" Richard said, gesturing toward the dining room. "I have had the chef prepare something special, though I assume your palate has been ruined by all that fast food you serve in those motels of yours." We moved to the dining room. The table was long enough to seat 20 people, but only 4 places were set at one end. The vast emptiness of the mahogany surface stretched out into the shadows. We sat down, Richard at the head, Elena to his right, Julian to his left, and me opposite him. The distance between us felt like a battlefield. The service began in silence. The young staff member brought out plates of consommé. The only sound in the room was the clink of silver spoons against fine china. It was a suffocating silence, heavy with unsaid words and buried resentments. I watched Elena. She was barely eating, just pushing the liquid around her bowl. Julian was eating too fast, washing every bite down with wine. "So," Richard began, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin, "I read the article in the Tribune about your latest opening, the Azure." "That is right," I said. "Occupancy is at 95% for the first quarter." Richard chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound. 95%. Impressive. For a volume business, I suppose. Tell me, Stephen, do you still put those little mints on the pillows? Or is that too high-end for your clientele? I took a sip of my wine. It was a Cabernet decanted, so the bottle wasn't visible. I swirled it on my tongue. It was young tannic and harsh. It was a $20 bottle of wine. 5 years ago, Richard would rather have died than serve a guest anything less than a vintage Bordeaux. "We focus on experience, Richard," I said, using his first name intentionally. I saw his jaw tighten. "Modern travelers do not care about mints. They care about connectivity, design, and efficiency. That is why our profit margins are triple the industry standard." "Profit margins," Richard scoffed, cutting into his steak, which had just been served. "Spoken like a true shopkeeper. You always did have the soul of an accountant, Stephen. No vision, no grandeur. You build boxes for people to sleep in. I build legacies." "Sterling Capital has certainly built a legacy," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "Exactly," Richard said, pointing his knife at me. "We shape skylines, we define cities. While you are worrying about the price of laundry detergent, I am negotiating deals that change the geopolitical landscape. Is that what you are doing? I asked. I heard the South American project was complex. The knife froze in his hand for a fraction of a second. It was a micro-reaction, a glitch in the matrix. Elena dropped her fork. It clattered loudly against her plate. Business is always complex, Richard said slowly, resuming his cutting. But you wouldn't understand high-stakes international development. It requires a certain stomach, a certain pedigree. He was trying to bait me. He was trying to make me defend myself, to make me list my accomplishments so he could tear them down. It was his favorite game, gaslighting. If he could make me feel small, he could control me. You are right, I said, taking a bite of the steak. It was slightly overcooked. I probably wouldn't understand. I am just a hotelier. My lack of defense seemed to irritate him more than an argument would have. He frowned, his eyes narrowing. He expected the angry rebellion of the son he had exiled. He did not know how to handle the indifference of a peer. "And how is that little wife of yours?" he asked, changing the angle of attack. "Sarah, was it? The one who dragged you down into the gutter? Is she still chasing ambulances?" "Sarah is a partner at her firm now," I said, "specializing in corporate restructuring and bankruptcy law. She is very good at spotting when a company is about to collapse." Julian choked on his wine. He coughed violently, his face turning red. Elena reached out to pat his back, but he slapped her hand away. Richard stared at me. The air in the room grew even colder. "Is that a threat, Stephen?" "It is a statement of fact," I replied. "You asked about her career." Richard put his knife and fork down. He leaned forward, his elbows on the table. The facade of the polite host was slipping. The desperation was starting to bleed through. "Let's skip the pleasantries," Richard said, his voice dropping. "I brought you here because I am feeling generous. I am looking to expand the board of Sterling Capital. I need fresh blood, people who understand the modern market." "You want me on your board?" I asked, feigning surprise. "I am willing to consider it," he said, trying to sound magnanimous. "But of course we would need to consolidate our interests. It makes no sense for the family to have fragmented assets. If you were to bring Horizon under the Sterling umbrella, we could create a conglomerate that would dominate the market." There it was. The hook. He did not just want money. He wanted to swallow my company whole. He wanted to take the thing I had built and slap his name on it, using my assets to plug the massive hole in his sinking ship. "You want to acquire Horizon?" I asked. "What is the valuation you are proposing?" "We would do a stock swap," Richard said quickly. "Sterling stock for Horizon stock. You would be a vice chairman. It is a promotion, Stephen. You would finally be playing in the big leagues." I looked at him. I looked at the shine on his suit, the cheap wine in his glass, and the terror in his wife's eyes. He was offering me worthless paper in exchange for a gold mine. He thought I was stupid. He thought I was so desperate for his approval that I would hand over $580 million just to see my name next to his on a piece of letterhead. "Who are your current major shareholders?" I asked. "If we are talking about a merger, I would need to know who I am getting into bed with." "That is confidential," Richard snapped. "But the board is fully behind me. We are solid." "Are you?" I asked softly. "Because usually when a company is solid, the chairman does not serve supermarket wine at a family reunion." Richard slammed his hand on the table. The glasses jumped. "How dare you? I invite you into my home. I offer you a seat at the table of kings, and you insult me?" "I am not insulting you, Father," I said, wiping my mouth and placing the napkin on the table. "I am appraising you, and right now the valuation isn't looking good." "You ungrateful little brat," Julian hissed from across the table. "Dad is trying to help you. You should be on your knees thanking him." "Quiet, Julian," Richard barked. He turned his gaze back to me, his face flushing a dark, unhealthy red. "You think you are smart, Stephen? You think because you made a few dollars selling clean sheets to tourists that you are my equal? You are nothing. You are a rounding error in my ledger." "If I am nothing," I said, leaning back in my chair, "then why are you sweating?" It was true. Beads of perspiration were forming on Richard's forehead, right at the hairline. The room was cold, but he was burning up. "I am not sweating," he spat. "You are," I observed. "And your left hand is shaking. You are hiding it under the table, but I can see the vibration in your shoulder. You are terrified, Richard. What is it? Is the wolf at the door? Or is he already in the house?" Richard stared at me. For a moment the mask dropped completely. I saw raw, naked panic. It wasn't just financial ruin he was afraid of. It was the loss of control. He was a man who had defined his entire existence by his ability to command, and now the command was failing. He needed cash. He needed it tonight. He needed me to sign something, anything, that he could take to the bank to buy himself another week of life. "Fine," Richard said, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. "You want to play hardball. I can play hardball. I didn't want to do this, Stephen. I wanted to do this the nice way. I wanted to give you a chance to come home with dignity." He stood up abruptly. The chair scraped harsh and loud against the wood floor. "Come to the study," he commanded. "We are done with dinner. There is some paperwork we need to review, and you are going to sign it. Because if you don't, you won't be leaving this house tonight." Elena let out a small whimper. Julian looked down at his plate. I stood up slowly, buttoning my jacket. I felt the weight of the folder in my inside pocket against my ribs. The trap had been sprung, but Richard didn't realize he had caught a tiger, not a mouse. "Lead the way," I said. As I followed him out of the dining room, I took one last look at the table. The meat was cold, the wine was sour, the family was broken. It was a feast of ghosts, and I was the only living thing in the room. The air in the hallway felt tighter now, the walls closing in. The claustrophobia was real, but it wasn't fear. It was the pressure of the storm before it broke. And inside the study, the lightning was waiting to strike. The study was a mausoleum of dark mahogany and darker memories. As I crossed the threshold, the air grew heavy, saturated with the stale scent of expensive cigars and old leather. This room had been the site of every significant punishment in my childhood. It was where my report cards were scrutinized with a magnifying glass, where my friends were deemed unsuitable, and where my dreams were systematically dismantled before they could take root. Richard walked to the humidor on his desk, his back to me. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind us, and the sound was like a lock tumbling into place. We were alone. The pretense of the family dinner, the snide remarks about wine, and the petty insults about my clothes were gone. The atmosphere shifted from awkward to lethal in the span of a heartbeat. "Sit," Richard commanded. He did not point to a chair. He knew I knew which one was mine. The low, uncomfortable stiff-backed chair facing the massive desk. It was positioned lower than his executive leather throne, designed to make anyone sitting in it feel small like a child called into the principal's office. I sat. I kept my back straight, refusing to slump, but I let my hands rest on my knees, keeping them visible. I needed him to see what I wanted him to see. Richard turned around. He had clipped the end of a cigar but did not light it. He held it like a baton, rolling it between his fingers. He bypassed the liquor cabinet and leaned against the edge of his desk, towering over me. The distance between us was less than 3 feet, but the chasm was infinite. "You are a smart boy, Stephen," he began, his voice dropping to a conversational, almost intimate volume. This was the dangerous Richard. The shouting Richard was manageable. The quiet Richard was plotting. "You always were. A bit emotional, perhaps. A bit prone to flights of fancy. But smart. I am 38 years old, Richard, I said, keeping my voice steady. I am not a boy. To me, you will always be the child who can't follow instructions, he countered smoothly. But let us not dwell on history. Let us talk about the future, specifically your future. He reached behind him and picked up a blue folder that had been sitting on his blotter. He tossed it onto the desk in front of me. It landed with a slap that echoed in the silent room. Read it! I reached forward and flipped the cover open. It was a single document drafted on the letterhead of Sterling Capital's legal department. I scanned the legalese, my eyes catching the key phrases. Irrevocable transfer of controlling interest. Horizon Luxury Group merger of assets. Power of attorney. It was a surrender document. If I signed this, I would effectively be handing over my entire company, my life's work, my $580 million empire, to Sterling Capital. I would be left with a ceremonial title and zero decision-making power. Richard would have full access to my liquidity, my properties, and my credit lines. I looked up at him, forcing a look of bewilderment onto my face. You cannot be serious. You want me to give you my company for nothing? Not for nothing, Richard smiled, but it was a grimace. For family, for legacy, and for your own protection. Protection from what? I asked. I am doing fine. My company is thriving. Yours is the one that is... Careful. Richard cut me off, his voice snapping like a whip. Do not finish that sentence. You think you know what is happening, but you have no idea. He moved around the desk and sat in his chair, leaning back into the shadows. You are not going to sign that because you want to, Stephen. You are going to sign it because the alternative is unpleasant. I am not signing anything, I said, closing the blue folder. I'm leaving. This meeting is over. I made a move to stand up. Sit down, Richard roared. The explosion of noise was so sudden that I froze half-risen. I said sit down. He opened a drawer and pulled out a second folder. This one was red. He did not toss it. He slid it across the desk with slow, deliberate malice. It stopped, inches from my hand. Open it, he whispered. I sat back down slowly. My heart was beginning to hammer against my ribs, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of the performance. This was the moment Sarah and I had anticipated. This was the trap. I opened the red folder. The first thing I saw was the logo of St. Jude's Psychiatric Institute. Below it were the words, Petition for Involuntary Emergency Commitment. I felt a cold chill that was entirely real. Even knowing it was coming, seeing it in black and white was visceral. I scanned the pages. Patient name, Stephen Martinez. Diagnosis, acute paranoid. Schizophrenia with narcissistic delusions. Risk assessment, immediate danger to self and others. My eyes flew to the signature at the bottom of the assessment. Dr. Arthur Blackwood, M.D. Blackwood, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Your golf partner, the man who cheated on his scorecard at the club championship last year. Doctor, Blackwood is a respected psychiatrist, Richard said, lighting his cigar now. The flame illuminated the malicious glint in his eyes. And he is very concerned about you, Stephen. We both are. I have not seen Dr. Blackwood in 20 years, I said, reading the fabricated observations. This says he examined me yesterday. It says I was raving about conspiracies, that I threatened to burn down Sterling Manor. He is willing to testify to that, Richard said, blowing a cloud of smoke toward the ceiling. And I am willing to corroborate it. So is Elena. So is Julian. We are all very worried about your decline. I turned the page. There were transcripts of therapy sessions that never happened. But then I saw something that made my stomach turn. Mixed in with the lies were kernels of truth. Twisted, distorted truth. The grief counseling, I said, looking up at him. From when Mom died? You were very unstable then, Richard said, his voice dripping with faux sympathy. Crying spells, depression, inability to focus. You sought help. It is all on record. Dr. Blackwood has simply updated the file. He believes you have had a psychotic break. The stress of running a large company, the isolation, it has finally cracked you. This is insane, I said, my voice rising. This is a fabrication. No judge will sign this. The judge already has, Richard said. He pulled a sheet of paper from the back of the file and held it up. It bore the seal of the county court. An emergency 72-hour hold order. All I have to do is make a phone call, Richard said, placing the order on the desk. And 2 very large orderlies will come through those doors. They will sedate you. They will strap you to a gurney, and they will take you to St. Jude's. You will be in a padded room before midnight. I stared at the paper. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. He was weaponizing the one time I had been vulnerable, the time I had mourned the only parent who loved me, and using it to destroy me. And while I am locked up? I asked, forcing a tremor into my hand. While you are incapacitated, Richard explained, leaning forward, someone needs to look after your interests. As your father and next of kin, since your wife is not a blood relative and, arguably, part of your delusion, I will petition for emergency conservatorship. The courts prefer Stephen's family, Stephen, especially a family with my reputation. You will take control of Horizon, I said. The markets are jittery, Richard said, shrugging. If the CEO of a major hotel group is institutionalized for insanity, the stock will plummet. Investors will panic. I will step in as the steady hand. I will stabilize the ship. I will merge the assets to protect them. By the time you get out, if you get out, Horizon will be a subsidiary of Sterling Capital. And you will be the tragic figure who flew too close to the sun. He took a drag of the cigar, watching me through the haze. Of course, none of this has to happen. You can just sign the blue folder, a quiet, private transfer of power. You keep your dignity. You keep your freedom. You just lose the company. But let us be honest, Stephen. You were never meant to run an empire. It is too much pressure for you. Look at you. You are shaking. I looked down at my hands. I was vibrating them intentionally, a technique I learned from a method actor friend. My breath was coming in short, shallow gasps. You would do this? I asked, my voice cracking. You would lock your own son in a mental institution? You know what that place is like. You know what drugs they will pump into me. I do not care, Richard said. The words hung in the air. Absolute, unvarnished truth. I do not care about your feelings, Stephen. He continued, his face hard as granite. I do not care about your mental health. I do not care if you spend the rest of your life staring at a wall and drooling. I need the liquidity. Sterling Capital has a temporary cash flow issue. Your assets solve that. You are just a resource. You always were. He stood up and walked around the desk, stopping right next to my chair. He placed a heavy hand on my shoulder. It felt like a branding iron. You have 2 choices, he whispered into my ear. Option A. You sign the transfer, you walk out of here. You go back to your wife and you start over. You are good at starting over. Option B. I make the call, you disappear, and I take it all anyway. But in option B, you lose your mind as well as your money. He squeezed my shoulder hard. Be a good boy, Stephen. Do what you are told. He walked back to his chair and sat down, looking at his watch. I have a driver on standby for the hospital. He is 5 minutes away. You have 2 minutes to decide. I looked at the blue folder, then in the red folder, then at Richard. He looked triumphant. He looked like a god deciding the fate of a mortal. He saw the sweat on my brow, the shaking of my hands, the terror in my eyes. He saw exactly what he wanted to see. A broken victim. I stammered. I cannot go to the hospital. Please. Then sign, Richard said, pushing a gold fountain pen across the desk. Sign the transfer. I reached for the pen. My hand was trembling so violently that I fumbled it, knocking it against the wood before gripping it. I brought the tip of the pen to the signature line of the blue folder. The ink bled slightly onto the paper as I held it there, hesitating. Do it, Richard urged, his eyes hungry. Just your name. That is all it takes to make the pain stop. I looked up at him one last time. You really have no soul, do you? You would sacrifice me without a second thought. Business is business, Richard said, leaning back and crossing his arms. And I am a businessman. Now sign the paper, or I swear to God I will have you in a straitjacket within the hour. I looked down at the paper. The trap was sprung. He had committed. He had admitted to the blackmail, to the fraud, to the lack of care. He had laid out his entire plan. And he had done it while I was sitting in the victim's chair. He thought he was looking at a man on the edge of a breakdown. He was wrong. He was looking at a man who was checking the time. I took a deep, shuddering breath. I let the pen hover for one more second, letting the silence stretch, until it was screaming. Then I stopped shaking. I stopped hyperventilating. I sat up straight, my spine locking into place. The trembling in my hands vanished instantly. I placed the expensive gold pen down on the desk with a gentle click perfectly parallel to the transfer document. No, I said. The word was not shouted. It was spoken with the flat, calm resonance of a judge delivering a verdict. Richard blinked. The sudden change in my demeanor was jarring. He looked confused, like a predator whose prey had suddenly stood up and bared its teeth. What did you say? He asked. I said no, I repeated, my voice dropping the facade of fear entirely. I do not think I will sign this, Richard. And I do not think you are going to make that call. You think I am bluffing? Richard snarled, reaching for the landline phone on his desk. I will show you. I know you are not bluffing about the intent, I said, leaning forward. But you are bluffing about the leverage. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket. Richard froze his hand on the receiver. He watched as I pulled out my own folder. It was thick, black, and ominous. I placed it on top of his psychiatric report, covering Dr. Blackwood's signature completely. You have a file on me, I said, a cold smile touching my lips, the first genuine smile I had shown all night. That is cute. But you see, Dad, I have a file on you too. Richard stared at the black folder. The confidence began to drain from his face, replaced by the first flicker of genuine uncertainty. What is this? He demanded. This, I said, opening the cover, is why you are never going to threaten me again. The silence that followed my refusal was not empty. It was heavy, vibrating with the sudden shift in atmospheric pressure. Richard stared at me, his hand hovering over the phone, his mouth slightly open. The image of the terrified, trembling son he thought he had cornered was dissolving before his eyes, replaced by a man who was looking at him not with fear, but with the clinical detachment of a coroner examining a corpse. And then I laughed. It started low in my chest and rose up, a dry, humorless sound that bounced off the mahogany walls and the leather-bound books. It was not a laugh of joy. It was the sound of a guillotine blade dropping. It was cold, sharp, and it cut through the tension in the room like a razor. What is so funny? Richard demanded, his voice losing its smooth baritone control. You think this is a joke? You think the inside of a psychiatric ward is amusing? I leaned back in the uncomfortable chair, crossing my legs with deliberate slowness. I picked up the gold pen he had given me, the instrument of my supposed surrender, and twirled it between my fingers. I am laughing at your timing, Richard, I said, my voice steady and resonant. And I am laughing at your arrogance. You really have not paid attention to anything I have done for the last 15 years, have you? You still see the 20-year-old kid who didn't know how to balance a checkbook. You forgot that I have spent the last decade swimming with sharks, much bigger and hungrier than you. I am the shark, Richard snapped, slamming the receiver down. And you are in my water. No, I corrected him gently. You are not a shark. You are a whale. A beached, dying whale that is bleeding out into the ocean. And the scavengers are already circling. I reached for the black folder I had placed on the desk. It was thick, heavy, with the weight of facts. I flipped it open, the sound of the stiff paper, distinct and loud in the quiet room. Let us look at the reality, shall we? I said, running my finger down the first page. You threatened to take over Horizon to save Sterling Capital. You claimed you needed to consolidate assets. Oh, but that is not true, is it? You do not want to merge. You want to cannibalize. You need a fresh injection of capital because your own company is functionally deceased. That is a lie, Richard said, his face flushing purple. Sterling Capital is posting record numbers. Sterling Capital is posting creative fiction, I countered, pulling out a spreadsheet and sliding it across the desk to him. Let us talk about the Rio Verde development project in Venezuela, the crown jewel of your international portfolio. You told the shareholders it was 80% complete. You told the board that pre-sales were through the roof. I tapped the paper. But according to the satellite imaging and the on-ground reports I have right here, the construction site has been abandoned for 9 months. The government seized the land after your local partners failed to pay the bribes they promised. That is $85 million of liquidity that simply evaporated into the jungle. Richard looked at the document. I saw his eyes recognize the satellite photo. It was grainy, but the lack of structures was undeniable. Market fluctuations, he muttered, waving a hand dismissively. Political instability. We are suing for compensation. We will get that money back. You will not, I said, flipping to the next page. Because the legal entity you used to invest there was a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands, and that entity has already declared bankruptcy. But that is just the tip of the iceberg, isn't it? Let us talk about the tech sector. I pulled out another document. You poured $40 million into a quantum computing startup in Silicon Valley. A bold move. Visionary. Except the founder was indicted for fraud 3 weeks ago, and the assets are frozen by the SEC. You did not hedge that bet, Richard. You went all in. These are temporary setbacks, Richard shouted, standing up. He began to pace behind his desk, a caged animal looking for an exit. Every business has bad quarters. That is why I need Horizon, to bridge the gap. Once the market corrects itself, the market is not going to correct your gambling addiction. I interrupted, my voice sharpening. And that is what this is. You are not investing anymore. You are gambling. You are chasing losses. And when the banks cut you off, when the legitimate institutions looked at your books and saw the rot, you did what every desperate addict does. You went to the loan sharks. Richard stopped pacing. He turned to face me, and for the first time the color drained from his face. He looked pale, almost gray, under the warm light of the chandelier. I do not know what you are talking about, he whispered. Sit down, Richard, I commanded. He didn't move. I said sit down. He sank slowly into his chair. Vanguard Holdings, I said, the name clearly enunciating every syllable. The reaction was instantaneous. It was as if I had physically struck him. His pupils dilated. His breath hitched. You know them, don't you? I continued, looking at the dossier. They are not a bank. They do not have branches. They do not have customer service lines. They are a shadow banking consortium. They lend to people who cannot get money anywhere else. High risk, high interest, and very, very strict terms regarding collateral. I pulled out a copy of a loan agreement. It was dense, filled with complex clauses, but I had highlighted the most important section in bright yellow. On February 2nd, 2 years ago, You signed a promissory note with Vanguard Holdings, I recited, reading from the page. The principal amount was $300 million. The interest rate was 12% compounding monthly. The purpose of the loan was to cover the operating losses of Sterling Capital and to maintain your personal lifestyle. It was a bridge loan. Richard rasped his voice dry. Just to get us through the fiscal year. A bridge to nowhere, I said. Because you did not fix the problems. You just dug a deeper hole. You used that money to renovate this house. You bought a yacht you never use. You bought jewelry for Elena to keep her quiet. You burned through $300 million in 24 months. I leaned forward, locking eyes with him. But here is the part that really matters. The collateral clause. To secure this loan, you didn't just pledge the company assets. That wouldn't have been enough for Vanguard. They know the company is hollow. No, you pledged everything. I turned the page, revealing the list of collateral. You pledged Sterling Manor, I read. This house. The land it sits on. You pledged your personal art collection. Your vintage car collection. You pledged your entire stock portfolio. And you personally guaranteed the loan, meaning your own private bank accounts are on the line. Richard was gripping the arms of his chair so hard the leather creaked. He looked like he was having a cardiac event. It is standard procedure, he choked out. Just leverage. I have it under control. Do you? I asked softly. Because I looked at the maturity date of the loan. I pointed to the date at the bottom of the contract. The loan was a balloon payment structure, I explained, as if I were teaching a first-year business student. That means you paid interest only for 2 years, but at the end of the term, the full principal amount of $300 million was due in full. I paused for effect. The silence in the room was deafening. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked loudly, counting down seconds that Richard no longer had. The maturity date was February 2nd, I said. Today is February 4th. You are 48 hours past due, Richard. You have defaulted. I am renegotiating, Richard yelled, slamming his fist on the desk. I am in talks with them. They gave me an extension. I just need a little more time to move some assets around. That is why I need you to sign the Horizon transfer. If I can show them I have fresh collateral, they will extend the term. They did not give you an extension, I said calmly. Vanguard Holdings does not do extensions. That is not their business model. Their business model is acquisition through default. They do not want your interest payments anymore. They want the collateral. They want the meat. You do not know that, Richard spat. You do not know anything about my dealings with them. This is an internal matter. How did you even get this? This is confidential financial data. It is protected. You really underestimate Sarah, don't you? I asked, a tone of pride entering my voice. Richard froze. Sarah? Your wife? My wife, I nodded. The woman you called a gold digger. The woman you said wasn't smart enough to be in this family. She has been tracking your financial footprint for 6 months. She noticed the irregularities in the public filings of your shell companies. She followed the digital paper trail. She found the UCC filings, where Vanguard registered their liens against your property. Public records, Richard, if you know where to look. She has no right, Richard muttered, but the fight was leaving him. She has no right to snoop. She has every right, I said, because she knew you would come for us. She knew that when the walls started closing in, you would look for a scapegoat. You would look for a piggy bank to smash. And she was right. You invited me here tonight, not to reconnect, but to steal my life to pay for your mistakes. I closed the black folder. So let us be clear about where we stand, I said. You are not the king of the castle anymore. You are a trespasser. You are sitting in a chair you do not own, in a house you do not own, wearing a suit you probably charged to a credit card that is maxed out. You are $300 million in the hole, And the people you owe money to are not the kind who send polite letters. They are the kind who come and take. Richard was trembling now, but not with rage. It was pure, unadulterated fear. The reality of his situation was crashing down on him. The facade of the powerful patriarch had been stripped away, leaving a terrified old man who had gambled everything and lost. "You," he stammered, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for a way out. "You cannot prove the default. You do not know if they have called the loan yet." "Oh, but I do," I said, "because I know exactly how Vanguard operates. I know their playbook. When a borrower defaults, they don't call. They don't email. They invoke the confession of judgment clause you signed. It allows them to bypass the trial process and obtain a judgment against you immediately. It allows them to seize assets without warning." Richard looked sick. He knew I was right. He had signed that clause because he was arrogant, because he thought he would never actually default. He thought he could outsmart the system one last time. "You are in trouble, Dad," I said, using the word "dad" as a weapon. "Real trouble. The kind of trouble that doesn't just end in bankruptcy. It ends in total erasure. They will take the manor. They will take the cars. They will take the company. And you will be left on the street with nothing but the clothes on your back. Just like you left me 15 years ago." Richard stared at me, his eyes wet. The arrogance was gone. In its place was a pleading look, a desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, his son had found all this out in order to save him. "Stephen," he said, his voice cracking, "if you know all this, then you know I am desperate. I had no choice. I had to protect the family name. You have to help me. If you sign the transfer, if we combine the companies, the combined valuation will be enough to pay off Vanguard. We can refinance. We can save the manor. We can save everything." He reached out a shaking hand across the desk. "Please, I am your father. You cannot let them take everything. You cannot let me be destroyed." I looked at his hand. It was the same hand that had pointed to the door 15 years ago. The same hand that had signed the checks to ruin my credit. The same hand that had minutes ago tried to sign me into a mental asylum. "You are asking me to throw my $580 million company into a black hole to save you?" I asked. "You want me to set myself on fire to keep you warm?" "It is for the family!" Richard cried out. "It is for the legacy!" "The legacy is dead," I said coldly. "You killed it." I stood up. I buttoned my jacket. I picked up the blue folder, the transfer agreement he wanted me to sign, and tore it in half. The sound of ripping paper was loud and final. I dropped the pieces onto the desk. "I am not going to help you pay Vanguard, Richard," I said. Richard slumped back in his chair, looking like a man who had just heard his own death sentence. "Then why did you come? Why did you bring these files? Just to gloat? Just to watch me die?" "No," I said, walking towards the window and looking out at the snowstorm. "I didn't come to watch. I came to participate." I turned back to him. The time for the final reveal had arrived. "You asked how I know so much about the debt," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. "You asked how I know it is 48 hours overdue. You asked how I know they haven't called you yet." Richard looked up, confusion, warring with his despair. "Yes. How do you know?" "I know," I said, walking back to the desk and leaning over it until my face was inches from his. "Because Vanguard Holdings didn't want the bad publicity of foreclosing on a high-profile family like the Sterlings. It is messy. It attracts press. So yesterday morning they decided to sell the debt." Richard's eyes widened. "They sold it? To whom? Who holds the paper?" "They sold it to a distressed asset fund," I explained. "A fund that specializes in acquiring toxic debt, cleaning it up, and liquidating the collateral. A fund that isn't afraid of bad press. A fund that knows exactly what this property is worth. Who? Richard whispered, his voice trembling. Who did they sell it to? I smiled, and this time, it was the smile of the predator who had finally closed his jaws. They sold it to a holding company called Phoenix Ventures, I said. Does that name ring a bell? Richard shook his head slowly. No. It shouldn't, I said. It is a shell company, wholly owned by a parent corporation. I paused, savoring the moment. The parent corporation, I said, is Horizon Luxury Group. Richard stopped breathing. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He stared at me, his brain trying to process the impossible mathematics of what I had just said. You, he gasped. You? Me, I confirmed. I didn't come here to sign your papers, Richard. And I didn't come here to bail you out. I bought your debt. I bought the note from Vanguard for cents on the dollar because they were desperate to get it off their books. I own the $300 million loan. I own the mortgage on this house. I own the lien on your company. I tapped the desk with my finger. I am not your son right now, I said. I am your creditor, and I am here to collect. The silence in the study following my declaration was absolute, but it was fragile, like a sheet of glass, moments before impact. Richard stared at me, his eyes wide and unblinking, his brain struggling to compute the new reality I had just presented. The concept that the disappointment, the exile, the hotelier of cheap motels, now held the leash to his entire existence was too foreign for him to grasp instantly. It required a rewiring of his entire worldview. Then the denial kicked in. It was violent and loud. You are lying. Richard spat, his face twisting into a mask of pure fury. He slammed his hand onto the desk again, this time with enough force to rattle the lamp. You are a liar. You do not have that kind of capital. You do not have the leverage. This is a trick. A cheap parlor trick to scare me. He lunged for the intercom button on his desk, his finger jabbing it repeatedly. Security! He roared into the speaker. Higgins! Security! Get in here! Immediately! I have an intruder! Get the police on the line! He held the button down his chest, heaving, waiting for the heavy footsteps of the private security team that patrolled the grounds. He waited for the door to burst open. He waited for the validation of his authority. Nothing happened. The speaker crackled with static, but no voice replied. The heavy oak door remained shut. The hallway outside was silent. The only sound was the wind howling against the window panes, a mournful dirge for a dying empire. Richard pressed the button again, harder this time. Higgins, do you hear me? I said get in here. That is a direct order. Static. Silence. I watched him with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a specimen under a microscope. I did not move. I did not flinch. I simply waited for him to realize that the button was connected to nothing but empty air. They are not coming, Richard, I said softly. My voice was not loud, but it cut through his panic like a scalpel. He looked up at me, his fingers still pressing the useless plastic button. What did you do? He hissed. Did you cut the lines? That is criminal trespassing. That is sabotage. I did not cut anything, I replied, leaning back in the chair and tenting my fingers. I simply made a better offer. You see, when I bought the debt from Vanguard 48 hours ago, I also conducted a rapid due diligence of your operational expenses. I found that your security team, including loyal old Higgins, has not received a paycheck in 3 weeks. You have been telling them it is a processing error with the bank. Richard's face went pale. He pulled his hand back from the intercom as if it had burned him. Men like that do not work for loyalty, Richard, I continued. They work for money. And when they have mortgages to pay and families to feed, loyalty is a currency that devalues very quickly. I met with the head of your security detail in the driveway before I walked in. I showed him proof of funds. I guaranteed their back wages and offered them a 20% bonus to take the rest of the night off. They are currently sitting in the gatehouse enjoying a very nice catered dinner I had delivered. They are not going to come through that door, because the person signing their checks has changed. Richard stared at the door, betraying a look of total abandonment. The illusion of his power was stripping away layer by layer. First his financial secrecy, then his family's respect, and now his physical protection. He was alone in the room with me. "You bribed my staff," he whispered. "I paid your debts," I corrected him. "There is a difference. I am cleaning up your mess just like you asked. I am just doing it on my terms." He slumped back into his chair, the fight draining out of him. He looked smaller now, the grandiose persona of the tycoon dissolving into the reality of a frightened old man. But he was Richard Sterling. He would not go down without trying to find a loophole. "You bought the note," he said, his mind racing, trying to find an angle. "Fine. You bought the note. That makes you the lender. But lenders have to follow procedures. You have to give notice of default. You have to file for foreclosure. That takes months, years even. I will fight you in court. I will tie you up in litigation until you are old and gray. I will sue you for predatory lending. I will—" "Stop," I said. It was a single word spoken with the weight of a gavel striking the sound block. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the final document. It was not a thick folder. It was a single sheet of paper, heavy and cream-colored. I placed it gently on top of the pile of evidence I had already laid out. "You are assuming this is a standard mortgage," I said. "You are assuming you have the rights of a normal homeowner. But you do not. Because you didn't borrow from a bank, Richard. You borrowed from shadow bankers. And you were so arrogant, so sure that you would never default that you signed the one clause no lawyer would ever let his client sign." I pointed to the bold text at the top of the page. "The Confession of Judgment," I read aloud. Richard's breath hitched. He knew what it was. He had signed it thinking it was a formality, thinking he was untouchable. "For those who might not know," I said, my voice taking on a lecture-like quality, "a confession of judgment is a legal device. It is a clause where the borrower agrees in advance to accept a judgment against them in the event of non-payment. It effectively waives your right to a trial. It waives your right to a defense. It waives your right to notice." I looked him dead in the eye. "It means I do not have to sue you, Richard. I do not have to go to court. I do not have to wait for a judge to hear your sob story. I simply file this affidavit with the county clerk, which my legal team did exactly 45 minutes ago, and the judgment is automatic. It is instant." I tapped the paper. "This isn't a negotiation," I said. "And this isn't a threat. This is a notification. As of 45 minutes ago, Horizon Luxury Group is the legal owner of Sterling Capital. We are the legal owners of this estate. We control your accounts. We control your assets. We control the chair you are sitting in." "No!" Richard gasped, clutching the armrests. "That is not possible. You cannot just take it." "I did not take it," I said. "You gave it to me. You signed it away 2 years ago when you took $300 million you couldn't pay back. You gambled the deed to your house and the house won." I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "The 48-hour grace period expired at midnight yesterday. You are trespassing, Richard. Technically, I could have the police remove you right now. But I wanted to do this face to face." Richard made a sound that was somewhere between a sob and a choke. He pressed his hand to his chest, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. His breathing became rapid and shallow, a desperate gasping for air. "My heart," he wheezed. "Stephen, my pills in the drawer." I watched him. I sat there 5 feet away, and I watched the man who had tormented me for 38 years gasp for breath. I watched the man who had just tried to lock me in a padded room beg for help. I did not move to the drawer. I did not call for help. I simply sat there witnessing his collapse. It wasn't cruelty. It was a total absence of sympathy. He had burned that bridge down to the pilings. "You are having a panic attack," I said calmly. "It feels like a heart attack, but it is not. It is just the weight of your own ego crushing your lungs. Breathe through it, Richard. You need to be awake for the next part." He groaned his head, lolling back against the leather. He was broken. The titan of industry was gone. All that was left was a bankrupt debtor. I stood up slowly. I picked up the blue folder, the one containing the transfer of my company that he had tried to force me to sign. I tossed it into the wastebasket. Then I picked up the red folder, the psychiatric file, the lies, the fabrication by Dr. Blackwood intended to strip me of my freedom. I held it up in front of his face. "You wanted to declare me incompetent," I said. "You wanted to say I was delusional. You wanted to erase me." I took the thick stack of papers in both hands. With a sharp, ripping sound that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room, I tore the file in half. Richard flinched at the sound. I put the halves together and tore them again and again. The tough paper resisted, but my anger gave me strength. I shredded the lies into strips, into confetti, into nothingness. "This is what your power amounts to," I said, my voice cold and final. "Paper, just paper." I opened my hands and let the pieces fall. They drifted down onto the desk, covering the expensive mahogany, covering the confession of judgment, covering Richard's trembling hands. They fell like snow. They fell like the ashes of a burning building. They fell like the worthless currency burned at a funeral for the dead. "You tried to bury me," I said, watching the white strips settle on his dark suit. "But you forgot that I am the one holding the shovel." I leaned down, placing my hands flat on the desk looming over him. "The company is mine. The house is mine. The debt is settled. Now get out of my chair." The silence in the room was shattered not by a scream, but by a ringtone. It was the default, jarring chime of Richard's personal cell phone vibrating violently against the mahogany desk, where the shredded remains of his lies still lay like snow. He stared at the device as if it were a bomb. The screen lit up, displaying the name of his chief financial officer. Then the landline on the desk began to ring, a harsh, mechanical trill that cut through the air. Then the tablet sitting on the side table pinged with an urgent notification. It was a cascade, a digital avalanche. The world outside the manor walls had just woken up to the news, and the floodgates were opening. "Answer it," I said, my voice cutting through the cacophony. Richard did not move. He was paralyzed, his eyes darting between the buzzing cell phone and the screaming landline. He looked like a man standing in the center of a firing squad, unsure which bullet would hit him first. "If you do not answer, I will," I said, reaching for the speakerphone button on the landline. "Do not touch that," Richard barked, finding his voice. He snatched the receiver up his hand, shaking so badly he almost dropped it. "This is Sterling." I watched his face. It was a study in disintegration. "What?" Richard snapped into the phone. "Calm down, man. Speak clearly. What notice?" There was a pause, and in the silence of the room, I could hear the tinny, panicked voice on the other end. It was Harrison, the company's lead counsel. "They are here, Richard," the voice squeaked, loud enough for me to hear. "The auditors. They just walked into the headquarters. They have a court order. They are locking down the servers. They are freezing the accounts. They say the board has been dissolved." "That is impossible!" Richard roared, spit flying from his lips. "I am the chairman of the board. I did not authorize any of this. Kick them out. Call security." "I cannot," Harrison's voice cracked. "They have a confession of judgment, Richard. It is signed by you. And they have a new directive from the new holding company. They just sent over the resolution." "What resolution?" Richard demanded, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "The resolution appointing the new chairman," the lawyer stammered. "It is effective immediately. All executive powers have been transferred." "To whom?" Richard whispered, though he already knew the answer. He just needed to hear it spoken aloud, to believe the nightmare was real. "To Stephen Martinez," the lawyer said. "The new chairman is Stephen Martinez." Richard dropped the receiver. It clattered onto the desk, the cord tangling with the torn pieces of the psychiatric file. He did not hang up. He just let it lie there, the lawyer's voice still buzzing confusedly from the earpiece. Richard looked at me. The fear in his eyes had mutated into something more primal. It was the cornered, irrational rage of a beast that realizes it is trapped. The alcohol he had consumed at dinner combined with the adrenaline, and the shock snapped the last thread of his composure. "You," he growled, a low, guttural sound rising from his chest. "You thief. You ungrateful, parasitic little—" He launched himself at me. It was a clumsy, desperate motion. He tried to scramble over the corner of the heavy desk to get to me, his hands clawing at the air, reaching for my throat. But he was 65 years old, overweight and intoxicated. His foot caught on the leg of the chair, and his coordination failed him entirely. He didn't reach me. He didn't even come close. He crashed into the side of the desk, knocking over a heavy brass lamp, and sprawled onto the Persian rug with a heavy, wet thud. The breath left his body in a wheezing groan. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I did not raise a hand to defend myself because there was no need. I simply stood there, hands in my pockets, looking down at the man who had once terrified me. He looked pathetic. He was struggling to push himself up his expensive suit, bunched up around his waist, his face pressed against the floor. He was gasping for air, cursing inchoately, flailing like a beetle overturned on its back. "Get up, Richard," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "You are embarrassing yourself." The door to the study burst open. "Richard." It was Elena. She stood in the doorway, clutching her pearl necklace, her eyes wide with alarm. Behind her was Julian, looking disheveled and confused. They had heard the shouting, the crashing lamp, and the relentless ringing of the phones. "What is going on?" Julian asked, stepping into the room. "We heard a crash. Dad?" They saw Richard on the floor groaning, trying to pull himself up using the edge of the desk. They saw me standing over him, calm and untouched. "Stephen!" Elena shrieked, rushing to Richard's side but stopping short of actually touching him. "What did you do to him? Did you hit him? I will call the police. This is assault." "I did not touch him," I said calmly. "He fell. Gravity is a harsh mistress, Elena, much like bankruptcy." Elena froze. "Bankruptcy?" Richard finally managed to haul himself up to a sitting position, leaning heavily against the desk. He looked up at his wife and son, his eyes pleading for support for an ally. "Get him out," Richard wheezed, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Julian, get him out of here. He is trying to steal the company. He is trying to take the house." Julian looked at me, then at his father. He puffed out his chest, trying to summon some of the bravado he usually displayed when asking for a credit limit increase. "You need to leave, Stephen," Julian said, stepping forward. "Now, before I make you," I laughed. It was a soft, dry chuckle. "Make me? Julian, you cannot even make your own bed. Sit down." "This is my father's house," Julian shouted. "No," I said, my voice hardening. "It is not. Not anymore." I walked over to the desk and picked up the confession of judgment, holding it up for them to see. "As of an hour ago, this house, the cars in the garage, the furniture you are standing next to, and the entirety of Sterling Capital belong to Horizon Luxury Group," I announced. Your father defaulted on a $300 million loan to a shadow bank. He bet everything and lost. I bought the debt. I am the owner." The silence that followed was different from the previous silences. This was the silence of calculation. I watched the gears turning in Elena's and Julian's heads. I watched the information sink in. They weren't processing the tragedy of Richard's fall. They were processing the impact on their own lifestyles. Elena turned slowly to look at Richard. The concern on her face evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard look of horror. "Is this true?" she whispered. "Richard, tell me he is lying. Tell me you did not gamble the house." Richard looked down at the floor, unable to meet her gaze. "I had to. It was a temporary measure. I was going to fix it." "You lost the money?" Julian asked, his voice rising in pitch. "What about my trust fund? What about my shares?" "Gone," I answered for him. "The trust fund was leveraged as collateral 3 years ago. The shares are worthless paper. The company is insolvent, Julian. You are broke." The transformation was instantaneous. It was like watching a nature documentary, where the pack turns on the wounded leader. "You old fool!" Elena screamed, her face twisting into a mask of ugly rage. "You told me we were secure. You told me the prenup was just a formality because there was so much money it didn't matter. You lied to me." "Elena, please," Richard begged, reaching out for her hand. "We can fight this. We can—" She slapped his hand away. "Do not touch me. You have ruined me. I gave you the best years of my life and— for what? To end up on the street?" "And me," Julian shouted, pacing the room. "I was supposed to take over. I have plans. I have debts, Dad. I have gambling debts in Vegas. You promised you would cover them next month. What am I supposed to do now?" Richard looked at them, stunned. He looked at the wife he had bought, and the son he had spoiled, and he saw them for what they were. They were parasites. And now that the host was dying, they were angry that the meal was over. "Stop it!" Richard cried out, tears streaming down his face. "We are a family. We have to stick together." "Family?" Julian scoffed. "You are a loser, Dad. You are a broke old loser." I watched this scene with a grim satisfaction. This was the justice I had wanted. Not just the financial ruin, but the emotional unveiling. Richard had spent his life believing that money bought loyalty. Now he was learning the hard lesson that money only rents it. He looked at me. He looked past his screeching wife and his petulant son, and he locked eyes with me. I was the only one in the room who wasn't screaming. I was the only one who had actually built something real. He crawled, literally crawled, a few inches toward me on the rug. "Stephen," he choked out. "Stephen, please. Look at them. They do not care about me, but you are my son, my firstborn." "Now I am your son?" I asked, looking down at him. 10 minutes ago, I was a mentally unstable patient you wanted to lock away." "I was scared," Richard sobbed. "I was desperate. But I raised you, Stephen. I put a roof over your head for 20 years. I paid for your school. I made you the man you are. You cannot do this to your own father. You cannot throw me out in the snow like I did to you. You are better than that." He was playing the final card, the guilt card, the blood is thicker than water card. He was trying to invoke a debt of gratitude for a childhood that had been a prison. I crouched down so I was at eye level with him. I wanted him to see my eyes. I wanted him to see that there was no warmth there, only the reflection of his own coldness. "You are right about one thing, Richard," I said softly. "You made me the man I am. You taught me that weakness is fatal. You taught me that the world is a transaction. You taught me that there is no mercy in business." I paused, letting the words hang in the air. "But you are wrong about the rest. You did not raise me. You invested in me. You treated me like a stock option. And when the investment didn't yield the return you wanted, when I didn't become the obedient clone you desired, you dumped the stock. You wrote me off as a loss. You threw me out." Richard flinched, as if I had struck him. "I am not seeking revenge," I continued, my voice steady and cold. "Revenge is emotional. This is purely business. You are a distressed asset, Richard, and I am the liquidator. I am simply closing the account." I stood up and turned to the open door where the security guards, my security guards now, were waiting. They had arrived silently while the family was screaming. "Gentlemen," I said to the guards. "Yes, Mr. Martinez," the head of security said, stepping forward. He didn't even look at Richard. "Please escort Mr. Sterling, Mrs. Sterling and Julian to their rooms," I commanded. "They have 1 hour to pack their personal effects." "1 hour?" Elena shrieked. "That is impossible. I have furs. I have jewelry." "You can take clothing and toiletries," I said, cutting her off. "Everything else, the jewelry, the art, the electronics, is listed as collateral in the loan agreement. It stays. If you try to remove any asset belonging to the company, I will have you arrested for theft. The guards will supervise your packing." "Stephen, no!" Richard wailed, grabbing at my pant leg. "You cannot do this. This is my home. My father built this house." I stepped back, pulling my leg free from his grasp. I brushed the fabric where he had touched me. "It was your house," I said. "Now it is just a building. And you are trespassing." I looked at the guards. "Get them out of my sight." The guards moved in. They lifted Richard from the floor. He hung between them, limp and weeping, a broken king dragged from his throne. Elena was crying about her diamonds. Julian was cursing about his debts. I turned my back on them. I walked to the window and looked out at the storm. The snow was still falling white and clean, covering the dark grounds of the estate. Behind me, the sounds of their protests faded down the hallway, replaced by the efficient silence of the new order. I took a deep breath. The air in the study no longer smelled of stale cigars and fear. It smelled of nothing. It was a blank slate. I walked over to the desk, picked up the phone receiver that was still dangling, and gently placed it back on the cradle. The line disconnected. The connection to the past was severed. It was done. The arrival of my team was not a raid. It was a foreclosure. It was executed with the silent, terrifying efficiency of a military operation conducted by people in $3,000 suits. Through the front windows of the study, I watched the convoy of black SUVs roll up the long, snow-covered driveway. They moved in a perfect column, their headlights cutting through the blizzard like lasers. There were no sirens. There were no shouting police officers. There was just the undeniable weight of corporate authority. The front doors of Sterling Manor swung open and my people flooded into the foyer. Leading them was Eleanor Vance, the head of my legal acquisition team. She was a woman who could dismantle a corporation faster than a mechanic could strip an engine. Behind her were 6 forensic auditors, 4 private security contractors, and a team of professional movers holding empty plastic crates. I walked out of the study to meet them in the grand hallway. The air in the house had changed. It no longer felt like a home. It felt like a liquidation site. "Mr. Martinez," Eleanor said, nodding to me. She handed me a tablet. "The writ of possession has been digitally filed and acknowledged by the sheriff's office. We have full legal clearance to secure the premises and inventory the assets. The family has been contained." "They are upstairs packing," I said, taking the tablet. "Make sure they are supervised. Strictly personal effects only. Clothing, toiletries, and medication. Nothing else leaves this house." "Understood," Eleanor said. She signaled to her team. "You heard the chairman. Sector 1 is the master suite. Sector 2 is the guest wing. Tag everything. If it has a barcode or a serial number, it belongs to Horizon." I watched them disperse. It was a beautiful thing to witness. For years, Richard had used lawyers and accountants as weapons to bludgeon me. Now I was watching my own army dismantle his fortress, brick by brick. I began my own walk through the house. I needed to see it. I needed to see the physical manifestation of the debt. I walked into the dining room where the cold steak still sat on the plates. I picked up a silver candelabra. It was heavy, solid sterling silver, dating back to the 19th century. I turned it over. There was a small sticker on the bottom from the auction house, where Richard had bought it 3 years ago. "Asset," I said aloud. I walked into the gallery hallway. The walls were lined with paintings. I stopped in front of a landscape that Richard claimed was a Turner. I looked at the inventory list on the tablet. It was listed as collateral for the Vanguard loan. "Asset," I whispered. Every object in this house, every rug, every statue, every bottle of wine was no longer a possession. It was a line item on a spreadsheet. It was currency to be recovered. I made my way toward the formal living room, a space that was rarely used except to impress guests. The double doors were partially open. I pushed them wide and stepped inside. I expected the room to be empty. It was not. Sitting in a wingback chair near the unlit fireplace was a man. He was nursing a tumbler of amber liquid, looking bored. He was wearing a tweed jacket that had seen better days and a pair of wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose. It was Dr. Arthur Blackwood. The corrupt psychiatrist looked up as I entered. He did not look alarmed. He smiled a greasy, condescending expression that made my skin crawl. He evidently thought I was Richard returning from the study. "About time, Richard," Blackwood said, swirling his drink. "I have been sitting here for an hour. The scotch is excellent, but my patience is thin. Did you get the boy to sign the transfer, or do I need to prepare the syringe?" He squinted, realizing his mistake, as I stepped into the light. He didn't recognize me at first. To him, I was just a name on a file of diagnosis to be forged. "Who are you?" Blackwood asked, sitting up straighter. "Where is Mr. Sterling?" "Mr. Sterling is currently indisposed," I said, closing the doors behind me. The click of the latch was loud in the quiet room. "I am Stephen Martinez." Blackwood froze. The glass halted halfway to his mouth. He looked at me, processing the name. Then a mask of professional concern slid over his face. It was a clumsy transition. "Ah," he said, setting the glass down. "Stephen, I am Dr. Blackwood. Your father asked me to stop by. He has been very worried about your episodes. I was hoping we could have a chat." "Drop the act, Doctor," I said, walking toward him. "The play is over. The curtain has fallen." "I am not sure what you mean," Blackwood said, standing up. He was shorter than I expected, and he smelled of stale tobacco. "I am a medical professional. I am here to conduct an assessment." "You are here to facilitate a kidnapping," I corrected him. "I read your file, Arthur. Acute paranoid schizophrenia. Immediate danger to self. Very creative writing. Did Richard dictate that to you, or did you come up with it yourself?" "I stand by my medical opinion," Blackwood blustered, though his eyes were darting toward the door. "If you are experiencing paranoia, that only confirms my diagnosis. Now, if you will excuse me, I need to speak with your father." He tried to step around me. I moved sideways, blocking his path. I was younger, stronger, and infinitely more angry. "You are not going anywhere," I said. I pulled a folded piece of paper from my pocket. It wasn't the fake medical file. It was a printout of a bank transfer. "This is a transaction record from the Cayman Islands," I said, holding it up. "Dated 3 days ago. $50,000 deposited into an account held by Blackwood Consulting. The source of the funds is one of Richard Sterling's shell companies." Blackwood's face went pale. The arrogance evaporated, leaving behind the sweaty fear of a man caught red-handed. "That is a consulting fee," he stammered. "For what?" I asked. "You haven't treated a patient in 10 years. You are a rubber stamp, Arthur. You sell your signature to wealthy men who want to dispose of inconvenient relatives. I wonder how many other people you have locked away. How many lives have you ruined for $50,000? You cannot prove anything, Blackwood whispered, backing away until his legs hit the chair. I have the metadata from the file you created, I said, stepping closer. It shows the document was created yesterday. But your report claims you examined me 3 weeks ago. That is fraud. That is malpractice. And combined with the payment, it is conspiracy to commit felony kidnapping. I took out my phone and held it up. I have the state medical board on speed dial. I also have the number for the district attorney. I can ruin you in 2 phone calls, Arthur. You will lose your license. You will lose your pension. And you will spend the next 10 years in a cell next to people who do not take kindly to doctors who abuse the system. Blackwood collapsed into the chair. He looked small and defeated. What do you want? I want you out of my house, I said. And I want you out of the profession. I pointed to the door. You are going to leave here. You are going to go straight to your office. You are going to shred your license. You are going to initiate your immediate retirement. If I ever see your name on a medical document again, if I ever hear that you are practicing medicine in any capacity, I will send this file to the police. Do you understand? Yes, Blackwood croaked. Yes, I understand. Then run, I said. He didn't wait to be told twice. He scrambled out of the chair, forgetting his coat, forgetting his dignity. He rushed past me, fumbling with the door handle, and practically sprinted into the hallway. I heard the front door open and slam shut a moment later. A rat fleeing a sinking ship. I took a deep breath, smoothing the front of my jacket. One loose end tied up. I walked back into the main hallway. The packing was finished. The procession was beginning. It was a sight that burned itself into my memory with the clarity of a photograph. Descending the grand staircase were the remnants of the Sterling dynasty. Elena came first. She was wearing a heavy fur coat, but underneath it, I could see she was still in her dinner dress. She was carrying a single Louis Vuitton overnighter. Her face was streaked with mascara tears. She looked at the auditors tagging the statues in the hallway with a mixture of hatred and disbelief. Behind her was Julian. He was struggling with 2 large suitcases. A security guard stepped forward and stopped him. "1 bag, sir," the guard said firmly, "as per the inventory protocol." "These are my clothes," Julian shouted, trying to push past. "You cannot take my clothes." "Check the bag," I commanded, from the bottom of the stairs. The guard unzipped the second suitcase. It wasn't clothes. It was stuffed with watches, silver picture frames, and a heavy jewelry box. "That is company property," I said. "Empty it." Julian watched in humiliation as the guard removed the stolen items one by one, placing them into a plastic crate. Julian was left with a half-empty suitcase of designer shirts. He looked at me with pure venom, but he said nothing. He knew he had no power here. Finally, Richard appeared at the top of the stairs. He looked older than he had an hour ago. He seemed to have shrunk inside his suit. He was not carrying a bag. He was clutching a small, framed photograph against his chest. I watched him descend, step by step. The same stairs he had walked down 15 years ago to tell me I was no longer his son. He reached the bottom and stopped in front of me. The movers paused. The lawyers stopped typing. The hallway went silent. Richard looked at me. His eyes were red-rimmed and hollow. "Stephen," he whispered, "where am I supposed to go?" "I have arranged a temporary apartment for you," I said, my voice devoid of malice. "It is a studio in the city. The rent is paid for 3 months. After that, you are on your own. It is more than you gave me." He looked at the photograph in his hands. I saw what it was. It was a picture of my mother. "Can I keep this?" he asked. His voice broke. "Please." I looked at the photo. My mother smiling young and full of hope before Richard had crushed her spirit too. "She belongs to the house," I said initially, the instinct to hurt him rising up. But then I looked at him. He was pathetic. Taking the photo wouldn't bring her back, and leaving it with him was a greater punishment. He would have to look at her face every day and remember what he had destroyed. "Take it," I said. "Take it and go." I signaled to the head of security. "Escort them out." The guards formed a perimeter around the three of them. They were marched toward the massive double doors. I followed them. I wanted to see this through to the very end. The guards pushed the heavy oak doors open. The wind howled into the foyer, carrying a blast of freezing air and swirling snow. The storm was still raging outside. The world was white and hostile. Elena stepped out, first shivering, immediately her heels slipping on the icy porch. Julian followed, hunching his shoulders against the wind. Richard stopped at the threshold. He turned back one last time. He looked at the warm golden light of the chandelier. He looked at the marble floors. He looked at the life he was leaving behind. And he looked at me. I was standing exactly where he had stood 15 years ago. I was standing on the warm side of the threshold. I was the one wearing the bespoke suit. I was the one with the power. "Goodbye, Richard," I said. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to curse me, perhaps to beg one last time, but the words didn't come. The wind stole them from his throat. He turned and stepped out into the night. I stepped forward and took hold of the heavy brass handles of the doors. I looked out at them. They were huddled together in the driveway, illuminated by the harsh security lights, the snow whipping around them. They looked small. They looked insignificant. Richard looked back at me, his face a mask of absolute despair. He realized the symmetry of the moment. He realized that the wheel had turned a full circle. I began to close the doors. "No!" Richard screamed. It was a ragged, desperate sound that tore through the wind. "Stephen, do not close the door, please. Sign the papers or I will lock you away," I whispered to myself, repeating the threat he had made to me only hours ago. "Well, Richard, you are locked out." I pushed the doors shut. The heavy latch clicked into place with a sound that felt like a bank vault ceiling. The screaming stopped. The howling of the wind was cut off. Silence returned to the hallway. Warm, expensive, absolute silence. I stood there for a long moment, my hand resting on the wood. I could feel the cold radiating from the other side, but it could not touch me. I was inside. I was safe. I turned around and looked at the foyer of my new house. The auditors were already moving to the next room. The lawyers were packing up their files. Life was moving on. I walked over to the nearest security guard. "Change the locks," I ordered. Tonight, the silence that descended upon Sterling Manor after the heavy oak doors clicked shut was not empty. It was heavy, textured, and profound. For the first time in 15 years, the house did not hum with the anxious energy of Richard Sterling. The frantic vibrations of his ambition, his fear, and his cruelty had been swept out into the snowstorm along with him. What remained was just Woodstone and the quiet shuffling of my legal team in the foyer, cataloging the spoils of war. I walked away from the door, my footsteps making a soft, rhythmic sound on the marble. I had spent years imagining this moment, in my darkest nights, sleeping in my car or staring at the ceiling of a cheap apartment. I had fantasized about the rush of victory. I had expected a surge of adrenaline, a desire to shout, a feeling of intoxicating dominance. I thought revenge would taste like champagne. But as I wandered through the ground floor, passing the library, where I had been exiled, and the dining room where I had been humiliated, I realized that revenge did not taste like champagne. It tasted like water. It was cool, clear, and essential. It did not make me drunk. It made me sober. I did not feel a wild joy. I felt a deep, resonating relief, like a diver finally breaking the surface after holding his breath for 2 minutes. The pressure was gone. The monster under the bed had not only been exposed as a man in a cheap suit, but he had been evicted. I found myself drawn not to the grand rooms I had just conquered, but to the back of the house, past the kitchens to a small, dusty storage room under the servants' staircase. It was a place Richard never visited. To him it was dead space. To me it was a tomb. I opened the door, the hinges groaning in protest. The air inside was stale, smelling of old paper and neglect. I switched on the single bare bulb, hanging from the ceiling. There, pushed into the furthest corner, behind a stack of discarded tax records, was an old battered steamer trunk. My hands did not shake as I knelt before it. I brushed away a thick layer of dust gray and soft like ash. The lock was broken, snapped years ago by a boy who needed to remember. I lifted the heavy lid. They were still there. Hundreds of photographs, albums with cracked spines, loose Polaroids curling at the edges. Richard had ordered them destroyed after my mother died. He had wanted to erase her, to scrub her softness from the hard angles of his life. He thought grief was a weakness and memory was a distraction. But Higgins, the old butler, had saved them. He had hidden them here, whispering the location to me before I was kicked out, a final gift from a man who had no power, but plenty of heart. I picked up a photo near the top. It was from a summer in the Hamptons, 30 years ago. My mother was sitting on a blanket, wearing a white sundress, laughing at something the photographer, probably me, had said. Her head was thrown back, her eyes crinkled with genuine, unburdened joy. She looked free. I traced the curve of her smile with my thumb. This was the real reason I had bought the debt. It wasn't just about the $580 million valuation or the strategic acquisition of assets. It wasn't even entirely about punishing Richard. It was about this box. It was about the fact that as long as Richard owned this house, her memory was being held hostage in a dark closet. "You are safe now," I whispered to the woman in the photo. "You are home." I sat there for a long time, sitting on the cold concrete floor, surrounded by the ghosts of a happiness that Richard had tried to strangle. I didn't feel like the CEO of a multinational corporation. I felt like a son who had finally kept a promise. My phone vibrated in my pocket, pulling me back to the present. It was a video call request from Sarah. I wiped the dust from my hands and accepted the call, propping the phone up against the trunk. Sarah's face filled the screen. She was back in our penthouse, sitting at the kitchen island with a mug of tea. Her hair was down and she looked tired but alert. "It is done," she said. Her voice was soft, but it carried the weight of finality. "The electronic transfer of title is complete. The county clerk just updated the registry. You officially own the deed to Sterling Manor, free and clear." "And the company?" I asked, looking at the small image of my wife. "The board of Sterling Capital has been formally dissolved," Sarah reported, looking at her notes. "We have frozen all trading on their stock. The hostile takeover is a matter of public record. The press release went out 10 minutes ago. Wall Street is in shock, Stephen. They are calling it the Red Wedding of the hospitality industry." "Let them talk," I said. "What about the liquidity?" "We have control of the accounts," Sarah said. "It is bad, Stephen. Worse than we thought. Richard really did hollow it out. But the assets are there. If we liquidate correctly, we can cover the $300 million debt we bought and still walk away with a significant profit." I looked around the dusty storage room. "I do not want the profit, Sarah. And I do not want the company." Sarah paused, tilting her head. "What do you mean? We talked about merging the portfolios. Sterling has some prime real estate in Europe." "No," I said firmly. "I do not want the name Sterling associated with Horizon. That name is poison. It stands for arrogance. It stands for failure." I picked up the stack of photos and held them close to my chest. "Here is the plan," I told her, my voice gaining strength. "We strip it. We break Sterling Capital down to the studs. We sell off the European hotels. We sell the jet, we sell the yacht, we liquidate every single asset that has Richard's fingerprints on it. And the proceeds, Sarah asked. We use the money to pay off the Vanguard loan so the books are clean, I said. And everything left over, every single dollar of profit, goes into a new trust. A trust for whom? For the Maria Martinez Foundation, I said, saying my mother's name aloud. We are going to start a non-profit. Domestic violence shelters, legal aid for women trapped in abusive marriages, scholarships for kids who get kicked out of their homes. We are going to take the money Richard used to hurt people, and we are going to use it to heal the exact kind of wounds he inflicted. Sarah smiled. It was a radiant, proud smile that warmed me even through the digital screen. I love it. I will have the papers drawn up by morning. The Maria Martinez Foundation. It has a nice ring to it. And the house? She asked. I am keeping the house, I said, looking at the ceiling. Not to live in. I could never live here. But I am going to renovate it. I am going to gut it, remove every trace of his bad taste, and turn it into the headquarters for the foundation. I want this place to be a sanctuary. I want the house that was a prison for my mother to be a gateway to freedom for thousands of other women. That is poetic justice, Sarah said. And what about Richard and the others? I sighed, rubbing the back of my neck. They are gone. I kicked them out. I know, Sarah said. But they will come back, not to the house, but they will come for money. They will sue. They will beg. They will go to the tabloids. I have thought about that, I said, and I have a solution. I stood up, lifting the heavy trunk with a grunt of effort. I am authorizing a stipend, a monthly allowance for Richard, Elena, and Julian. Stephen, Sarah warned, her lawyer instincts kicking in. You do not owe them a dime. They tried to commit you. I know, I interrupted. But if I leave them with nothing, they become desperate animals. Desperate animals bite. They will sell stories to the press. They will create noise. I do not want noise. I want silence. I walked out of the storage room, carrying the trunk down the hallway as I talked. The stipend will be modest, I explained. $3,000 a month for Richard, $2,000 for Elena, $1,500 for Julian. Enough to rent a small apartment, buy groceries, and pay for heat. But not enough for country clubs. Not enough for designer clothes. Not enough for dignity. That is barely poverty line for people like them, Sarah noted. Exactly, I said. It is enough to survive, but it is a reminder of who holds the purse strings. And there are conditions, strict ones. If they ever contact the press, the money stops. If they ever approach me or you, the money stops. If they ever try to enter a Horizon property, the money stops. It is not a gift, Sarah. It is a muzzle. You are a dangerous man, Stephen Martinez, Sarah said softly. I learned from the best, I replied grimly. I will see you at home, Sarah. I have one last thing to do. Come home soon, she said. I love you. I love you too. I ended the call and carried the trunk into the main library. I placed it gently on one of the leather armchairs. Then I turned my attention to the fireplace. The fire Richard had lit earlier was dying down to embers. The room was cooling. I walked over to the desk, where the shredded remains of the psychiatric file lay scattered. The confetti of my almost demise. I gathered the pieces of paper in my hands. The heavy bond paper felt sharp against my skin. I could see fragments of words. Paranoid, delusional, immediate commitment. I walked to the fireplace and threw the handful of paper onto the embers. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the edges of the paper began to curl and brown. A small flame licked up blue and orange, catching the ink. I stood there, watching the fire grow. I grabbed the poker and stirred the embers, feeding the flames. I threw the rest of the shredded file in. Then I reached into my pocket and pulled out the ripped pieces of the transfer agreement, the document that would have stolen my company. I threw that in too. As the fire roared to life, casting dancing shadows against the bookshelves, I felt a profound shift in my understanding of what I had just done. For years I had thought revenge was about inflicting pain. I thought it was about making Richard feel the same cold, hollow loneliness he had forced upon me. And yes, there was a satisfaction in seeing him cast out into the snow. But that was a byproduct, not the purpose. True revenge, I realized as I watched the word insanity turn into black ash, is not about destruction. It is about correction. It is about taking the power away from someone who abuses it and putting it into hands that will use it to build. Richard had used his money to control, to terrify, to silence. I had taken that money away. I had disarmed him. Without his checkbook, Richard Sterling was just a sad, angry old man. He wasn't a monster anymore. He was just a memory. I wasn't a victim who had escaped. I was a judge who had passed a sentence. And the sentence wasn't death. It was irrelevance. I watched the fire until the last scrap of paper was consumed. The lies were gone. The threats were smoke sucked up the chimney and dispersed into the winter night. I turned away from the fire and looked at the steamer trunk on the chair. My mother's photos. That was the only thing of value in this entire $50 million estate. I picked up the trunk. It was heavy, but it felt light in my arms. I walked out of the library, leaving the fire to burn itself out. I walked through the foyer, past the security guards, who nodded respectfully as I passed. I walked out the front door, the same door I had closed on Richard. The storm had broken. The snow had stopped falling, and the clouds were parting to reveal a sliver of a moon. The air was crisp and freezing, biting at my lungs, but it felt clean. My car was waiting. I put the trunk in the passenger seat, strapping it in like a precious passenger. I got into the driver's seat and started the engine. I didn't look back at the dark, looming silhouette of Sterling Manor. I didn't need to. I owned it now. It was just a line on a balance sheet, a shell to be repurposed. I put the car in gear and drove down the long, winding driveway, the tires crunching on the fresh snow. I was leaving the past behind, not fleeing from it, but closing the book on it. I was driving toward the city, toward Sarah, toward the future, toward a world where the name Martinez meant something different than the name Sterling. I was driving home. The next morning, the sun broke over Chicago, with a brilliance that felt almost apologetic for the violence of the storm the night before. The sky was a piercing, cloudless blue, the kind of winter sky that hurts your eyes if you look at it too long. I stood on the sidewalk outside the building that until 24 hours ago had been the headquarters of Sterling Capital. The air was frigid, biting at the exposed skin of my face. But it felt clean. It felt scrubbed new. Above me, the whine of hydraulic machinery pierced the morning traffic. I tilted my head back, shielding my eyes against the glare. A massive yellow crane was parked at the curb. Its arm extended 60 stories up. 2 workers in orange safety vests were suspended in a basket, welding torches sparking against the steel facade. They were not building anything. They were erasing. As I watched the massive gold-plated letter S, the first letter of my father's name, a symbol that had loomed over the financial district for 30 years, detached from the stone with a metallic groan. It hovered in the air for a moment, suspended by heavy chains, looking strangely fragile against the backdrop of the skyline. Then slowly, it began its descent toward the flatbed truck waiting in the alley. The Sterling Empire was coming down letter by letter. I did not feel a surge of malicious glee. I did not feel the urge to cheer. I felt a profound sense of quiet. It was the feeling of walking out of a noisy, crowded room into a silent, snow-covered forest. The noise in my head, the voice that had told me for decades that I wasn't good enough, that I was a failure, that I was an exile, had finally stopped. I adjusted my scarf and looked down the street. A black sedan was idling at the curb, its exhaust puffing white clouds into the air. Sarah was leaning against the passenger door, wrapped in a camel-colored wool coat, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. She wasn't looking at the building. She wasn't looking at the falling sign. She was looking at me. I walked toward her, the snow crunching beneath my boots. It was a satisfying sound, the sound of forward momentum. When I reached her, she didn't ask how I felt. She didn't ask if I was okay. She simply handed me a coffee and smiled. "Black 2 sugars," she said. "You know me," I replied, taking the cup. The warmth seeped through my gloves. "The sign is coming down fast," she noted, glancing up briefly as the letter T began to wobble. "Eleanor does not waste time," I said. "By noon, the building will be anonymous. By next week, it will be rebranded as the operational hub for the Maria Martinez Foundation and the new logistics center for Horizon." Sarah nodded, taking a sip of her drink. "And the staff?" "We kept the essential support staff," I said. "The secretaries, the janitors, the junior analysts, the people Richard ignored. They all got a 10% raise this morning and a guarantee of employment for the next 12 months. The executives, however, the ones who helped him cook the books, they are currently clearing out their desks." "Good," Sarah said. She opened the car door. "Are you ready to go? We have a flight to catch." I paused. "A flight?" "We are taking a vacation, Stephen," she said firmly. "We have not taken a real vacation in 6 years. I booked us 2 weeks in a secluded villa in the Maldives. No phones, no email, no hostile takeovers, just sand water and sleep." "I have a company to run," I protested weakly, though the idea of sleep sounded like paradise. "The company has a very competent COO," Sarah countered, "and she told me that if you call her before the 14th of the month, she will quit. Get in the car, Mr. Martinez." I laughed. It was a genuine light sound. "Yes, ma'am." As we navigated the morning traffic heading toward O'Hare International Airport, the city rolled past the windows. It looked different to me now. For years, Chicago had been a map of my trauma. Every corner held a memory of rejection or struggle. But now it was just a city I had conquered. Sarah reached over and took my hand, intertwining her fingers with mine. We didn't talk about the victory. We didn't rehash the details of the confrontation in the study or the look on Richard's face when I tore up the papers. That was the past. Winners do not dwell on the battle. They focus on the peace that follows. Instead, we talked about the future. We talked about the new Eco-Luxus hotel line I had been sketching on napkins for months. Hotels built entirely from sustainable materials designed to blend into nature rather than dominate it. We talked about the first gala for my mother's foundation, planning the guest list, not based on net worth, but on impact. We talked about maybe finally looking for a house that had a backyard for a dog. It was mundane conversation. It was boring. And it was the most beautiful conversation I had ever had. As for Richard Sterling, his story did not end with a bang, but with a whimper. I learned later through the detached reports of my legal team that he had settled into a small, one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. It was a walk up 3 flights of stairs that his bad knees hated. The neighborhood was safe, but working class. There were no doormen to open doors for him. There were no drivers to carry his bags. The monthly stipend I provided, $3,000, was deposited automatically on the 1st of every month. It was enough to pay his rent, buy decent food at the local market, and pay for his cable TV, but it was not enough for the country club. When he tried to go back to his old golf club, he was politely stopped at the gate. His membership had been revoked due to unsettled debts and conduct unbecoming. The friends he had bought with expensive dinners and lavish parties stopped returning his calls. They were sharks, just like he had been, and they had no use for a man who could no longer feed them. Elena left him within a week. She moved back to her parents in Florida, realizing that a life with a broke, angry old man was not what she had signed up for. Julian tried to sue me for his inheritance, but Sarah buried him in so much paperwork that he eventually gave up and took a job selling used cars at a dealership in Wisconsin. He was learning for the first time the value of a dollar he actually had to earn. Richard was left alone with his television and the photograph of my mother. I hoped in my more charitable moments that he looked at it and felt remorse. But I knew him too well. He likely looked at it and felt victimized. He would spend the rest of his years telling anyone who would listen, the cashier at the grocery store, the neighbor in the hallway, that he used to be a king, and that his ungrateful son had stolen his kingdom. But no one would believe him. He was just another old man in a worn-out coat, muttering about the good old days. I looked into the rearview mirror as we merged onto the highway. The skyline of downtown Chicago was shrinking behind us. The gap where the Sterling sign used to be was invisible from this distance. The building was just another steel needle in a haystack of glass. I realized then that I wasn't angry anymore. The hate that had fueled me for 15 years, the engine that had driven me to work 18-hour days and build an empire, had run out of gas. But the car was still moving. It was moving on a new fuel now. It was moving on purpose. I wasn't Richard Sterling's son anymore. I wasn't the boy who was kicked out. I wasn't even the avenging angel. I looked at my hand on the steering wheel. It was steady. I looked at the woman beside me who had loved me when I had nothing but a dream and a beat-up Honda. I was Stephen Martinez. I was a husband. I was a builder. And for the first time in my life, I was free. The road ahead was wide open, stretching out toward the horizon, where the blue sky met the flat, snow-covered plains. The sun was shining on the pavement, making the wet asphalt glitter like diamonds. "What are you thinking about?" Sarah asked softly, sensing my shift in mood. "I am thinking about the papers," I said, keeping my eyes on the road. "The transfer papers?" she asked. "No," I said. "The commitment papers. The ones he tried to make me sign. He said, 'Sign the papers or I will lock you away.' He thought the only way to deal with a problem was to put it in a cage." I smiled, a small, private smile. "He was right about one thing," I continued. "I did need to sign papers to get free. I just had to sign the right ones. I had to sign the checks. I had to sign the deeds. I had to sign my name on something that he couldn't touch." Sarah squeezed my hand. "You built a better cage, Stephen. You built a castle." "No," I corrected her. "I didn't build a castle. Castles are for hiding. I built a bridge. And now we are crossing it." The airport exit appeared ahead. I signaled and took the turn. The city vanished behind the tree line. The past was gone. The debt was paid. The ledger was closed. Sometimes to truly grow up, you do not just need to leave home. You need to buy it back, burn down the ghosts that haunt the hallways, and build something beautiful on the ashes. My father wanted to use his power to make me small. He wanted to use his money to make me silent. But he forgot the most important rule of investment. Never bet against a man who has nothing left to lose. He tried to bury me. He didn't know I was a seed. And now finally it is springtime. I drove on into the light, leaving the shadows where they belonged, in the rearview mirror. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. Please leave a comment below and share your thoughts on Stephen's journey. If you enjoyed this tale of justice and redemption, please subscribe to the Calm Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit that hype button to help this story reach more people. Your support means the world to us. Stay safe, and see you in the next story.